Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Ukrainian show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and our guest today is Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you, Sasha. Glad to be here as always.
Okay, so yesterday was a great event in Europe. The $90 billion for help to Ukraine was approved.
Yes.
It's not exactly saying what was ideal situation for Ukraine and Mr. Zelensky would be reparation credit based on this money that's stuck by Russia in
Right.
Europe, but that's next
Well,
stage for sure.
as we say sometimes, it's better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yep, agree. And so at least financially, Ukraine has nothing to worry about for at least next year,
Right.
2026, and more. Because if Europeans help with 2026, they will definitely help with 2027. It remains to be seen what kind of mechanism would be used, and so on.
Even more importantly, Sasha, that gives Ukraine the breathing room, the time, and the strategic flexibility within which to throw that decisive counterpunch that we've been talking about. That decisive counteroffensive that could actually force Russia to accept reality, which would be a good thing. Force reality to accept reality, declare victory, and go home, and at least get the kind of peace which would be more an armistice, resembling that which exists between North and South Korea. And even there, we must remember that North and South Korea are still technically in a state of war, but at least it's manageable. So we might be able to achieve a manageable peace, albeit one that we have to keep our powder dry.
Jonathan, what, in your opinion, prevents the peace talk to be successful and end up with some kind of agreement?
Okay, in other words, if I understand what you're getting at, is that what is it that is necessary to prevent an unacceptable peace from being forced upon Ukraine?
Yeah, we are talking about acceptable peace because if somebody would propose complete capitulation of Ukraine, that's also the end of war, but it's not acceptable.
It's not the end of war for the foreseeable future. Certainly not. And what is necessary is for, number one, for Zelensky to maintain his position. Don't be coerced or cajoled or otherwise compelled to accept an unacceptable peace, which results in any way, shape, or form rewarding Russia for having initiated the war to begin with. That would mean no surrender of additional territory, and that would be the worst case. No surrender of additional territory, and Russia is forced to accept peace with relatively ironclad, much firmer security guarantees from the United States in support of Ukraine and its European allies, and which gives Ukraine a much more acceptable breathing space, but at least does not lay Ukraine open to a subsequent resumption of the war by Russia in the near to intermediate future. That would be the best outcome that we could expect, assuming that Zelensky remains firm and does not allow himself to be pushed into an unacceptable agreement. So, yeah, with what needs to be done in the interim is for Ukraine and the Ukrainian military and political leadership to continue inflicting unacceptable losses and damage on the Russian economy. Continue the attack. Do not let up on their counterattacks, because they're still in a state of war. Therefore, keep on counterpunching and launching deep attacks and weakening Russia's ability to defend, particularly the Crimea. As they keep weakening those, and you notice they have kept on weakening the air defenses of Crimea. And I contend that is, although they're not saying it out loud, they're not trying to tip their hand, But the steady reduction of air defenses and other types of defenses in Crimea is, to me, a signal that if this war continues much longer, that Ukraine is going to be prepared and willing to launch that counteroffensive that isolates Crimea and sets the prerequisite for successful use of their air power over Crimea, supporting a counteroffensive with whatever strategic reserves they have cobbled together for that purpose. So that is what I'm continuing to watch for. It's what I'll be continuing to watch for, especially as we move into 2026, and particularly the early spring of 2026. That is when the weather will clear sufficiently for in my opinion, for Ukraine to launch a successful counteroffensive, because they will have succeeded in the interim in weakening the air defenses of Crimea and in weakening Russia's war-making potential in particular. So that's the trend I'm watching.
Yeah. Jonathan, if you take military history of Russia, you notice that they were much more successful in attack rather than in defense. You can take Second World War as an example, a recent example, when Russians were miserable in all 1941, and Germany actually took almost all European territory of Russia, stopped 10 kilometers away from Moscow, and later on, after Stalingrad, they finally came into offensive, and they were much more successful there. And I think it's not surprising, because for Germans, being away from their supply lines would be very, very difficult to have any meaningful resistance. They did have resistance, and they were able to counterattack near Kursk. But again, that's not the same when Russia, on their territory, their military production ramped up and producing thousands of fighters and tanks and other ammunition. So in this respect, Russia supposedly should be very successful in attacks of Ukraine, because Ukraine is for some time, considerable time, in defense. Yet, what's happening right now, the latest data shows that Russians are losing now 1,500 people a day. Every day they have same kind of village that I never heard the name ever. They would have 22 attacks a day. So they're sending small units of 100 people, 98 killed, 2 are coming back, they get another 98 again. Here is 100 people, go almost in half an hour. After 98 were killed, they send another 100. So this is insane, and they don't change tactics, because
No.
this new attack is exactly the same what was there before. So
well, you remember someone once said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So
that's the case.
And this is what the Russians are doing. Now, in an explanation of why in the Second World War the Russians were more successful, is that as the Germans invaded, they were stretching their supply lines. They had, remember, the German supply lines weren't much better than those of the Russians. They had horse-drawn wagons and a much smaller proportion of motorized logistical transport. I think Little Hart estimated that the German army that invaded Russia was about 10% motorized. Now, that's as compared to the American army in 1944 that invaded at Normandy. They were 100% motorized, and they went back across France a lot faster. So the thing was, as the Germans pushed the Russians, penetrated deep into Russia, the Russians were being forced closer and closer to their own sources of supply. They had much shorter lines of supply to worry about. They were, in effect, becoming stronger as they got closer and closer to their sources of supply. Then when they counterattacked, they were much more powerful locally than the Germans, who were all stretched out and outrunning their supply lines. So it's not too surprising that they were able locally to repel and surround German forces that had penetrated so far. Now, the other part of the equation that you were wondering about is how were the Russians then able to successfully drive the Germans out of the Soviet Union and thereby they would have to start extending their own supply lines and get farther and farther. Well, the factor that I pointed out previously that made up for that for the Russians was they were getting from the United States lots and lots of Ford trucks through Lend-Lease. And that gave the Soviet logistics capability a much more reliable supply capacity. So they were able to power their offensives for much longer. They could supply them much more easily. And that was probably the difference in enabling the Soviet Union to drive German forces out of Soviet territory based on what they had. Otherwise, without those Ford trucks, without an improved logistical capability, it would have taken the Russians a lot longer to force the Germans out. They would have gotten much more of a breathing space, and theoretically, a smarter German political and military leadership would have been able to sue for peace on the Eastern Front, withdraw, establish a new territory, and then divert their forces west to try and defeat the Allies, the Western Allies. That's if they had had a wiser strategic and political leadership, which they did not have. So, but the difference was logistics in this case. The Soviets had it in World War II, thanks to Lend-Lease from the U.S. Today, they don't have that. They're still stuck with the same lousy logistics system and the same level of corruption that you have discussed. And the Russians have a very corrupt logistical system. And it's corrupt even compared with it's more corrupt than most other nations. You know, pilfering from the supplies and just basically weakening their own military efforts. And as you have pointed out on previous programs, the Russians are in this 21st century war relying on donkeys and a very makeshift, ramshackle logistics system, which would be a disgrace in any other country that claims to have a modern military. But that is a huge weak link in the Russian military force. And
Jonathan, I've looked at a few videos recently from front lines, and they showed, for example, one of this meat attacks by Russia. Mm-hmm. So what happened is there are two kind of trucks filled with people. They're going to trucks. Then they have several bicycles and motorcycles. And then they had people who were just walking ahead for it to be slaughtered by Ukrainians. And it's a tragic. It's almost they're sending people, okay, just go and get killed. Okay. Go.
It would be funny. It would be funny if the results were not so tragic. Well, for the Ukrainians, it's funny.
But, yes, it is. Now, speaking about this Lend-Lease American trucks, now I remember from my childhood in Odessa, late 50s, early 60s, there were still a lot of American trucks available. They were going.
They were built to last. They were built to,
and they were not Fords. They were Studebakers. So maybe Studebaker was acquired by Ford, so it doesn't make any difference.
No. The quality standards expected of American equipment in wartime was much higher back then. And also keep in mind, what's fascinating to note is that in order for the calculation was made prior to the war in the American Victory Plan by the generals who devised it. One of the basic assumptions was that they could mobilize a maximum of 10% of American manpower, without damaging the wartime economy. That meant that they had theoretically a manpower pool of 14 million from which to draw personnel for the Army, Navy, Army Air Corps, and the Marines, and so forth, and for drawing that pool of manpower. In the event, they actually drew only 10 million. And they gave first priority to the Navy, then the Army Air Corps, because they reasoned they needed superiority and supremacy in sea power and air power. And the least amount went to the Army. And based on the Division 4 structure they had come up with, they constructed a 90-division Army. That was the army that they would have to beat both Germany and Japan with. And the idea is beat Germany first, then switch manpower over to the Pacific to finish beating Japan. And the assumption also was that the United States would not be relying on numerical superiority in order to beat the Axis on the ground. They would be relying on air supremacy to form a giant sledgehammer that would just beat the living daylights out of whatever got in front of the U.S. Army. And that's what they relied on in their invasion of Normandy. So it was a much different strategy. And now that's how they projected power, and a much different calculation. So right now, it's essentially the United States still has the world's best logistics system, and that is they still operate on those principles of have superiority on the sea, have superiority in the air, and give the Army the best equipment you possibly can, the best technical equipment you possibly can for when you engage the enemy.
John, this is exactly what certain Professor Dugin, he is dividing countries on sea powers and land powers. So according to him, all the countries, US, Canada, UK, New Zealand, Australia, they're all sea powers.
Yep.
And he is highly critical of sea powers. What he's saying, they are, because of their superiority in air and sea, they are grabbing the most valuable points, whether it's India or any other countries, and control them. And from there, they are continuing their, how he calls it, imperialistic wars against defenseless people of India and some other countries, wherever it might be, Iran or Saudi Arabia, or just almost any country in the world. Whereas Germany and Russia, they are continental powers.
Right.
So they cannot resist on the air and sea. But in continental warfare, they are much more powerful and capable to defeat the so-called sea powers and land powers. But you know what? It may never come to a land fight, because if you have so much superiority in the air and the sea, so you're winning by default. There is no
the continental power has no ability to reach out and touch you. To reach out and they cannot project power. The Russians cannot project power globally.
No.
The only power that can project power globally to any significant extent is still the United States. Now, there are other powers, such as China, who are trying to develop, shall we say, a sea denial capability, a local ability to defeat the sea powers of the West, if necessary, in order to exert influence over their area. And they probably would not get any interference from the West if China decided to project power against its neighbor Russia and reclaim territories that they claim have always been theirs. So there is that. And the sea powers basically have to adopt something similar to what I've been advocating, the geopolitical balancer. The Trump administration has, amazingly enough, moved somewhat in that direction, in that they are trying to reemphasize the Monroe Doctrine. We have supremacy in our sphere. They're in effect declaring that our sphere of influence is the Western Hemisphere, in accordance with the Monroe Doctrine. And by implication, they haven't ruled out the ability to project power elsewhere, but to do so in a more balanced fashion. And they are relying much more, for example, upon the European powers, but also by implication, they are relying on Ukraine to be able to act as the bulwark of European defense. It's a very delicate balancing act. It is, in my opinion, it is a strategic doctrine that has not fully matured yet and has shown its full implications. It will be interesting, for example, if the United States can, in its current military confrontation with Venezuela, be able to project enough power to achieve its political objectives of, shall we say, getting the Venezuela to stop shipping harmful drugs to the United States or whatever other objectives it has in mind, without overstepping its bounds and becoming embroiled in a land war in Venezuela, which would not be a desirable outcome, and for which the Congress would then be compelled to, according to our balance of power system and according to the Constitution, which grants Congress the right to declare war, then Congress would be compelled to say, Mr. President, you need to step back. You need to get out of the land war or immediately in Venezuela. They would say, you have accomplished your objective of stopping the flow of illegal drugs to the United States. Leave it at that. But we don't need to conquer the Western Hemisphere. We simply need to be recognized as a dominant power and discourage foreign powers from intervening in a hostile way in the Western Hemisphere. That is how you achieve balance. It's a very delicate art, Sasha. It's even more delicate than chess. I mean,
yes.
You see very few political moves that would, in your opinion or mine, rate an exclamation point, or even 2 exclamation points, or 3 exclamation points for a brilliancy prize. But Zelensky has made some very good political moves. You have to hand it to him.
Well, Jonathan, coming back to beginning of our program, when we were discussing what's still lacking for having a peace between Russia and Ukraine, and now we are coming back to just the beginning of Trump's presidency. Whenever he was announcing he'll make peace in 24 hours or 2
He
weeks.
miscalculated.
Okay, he miscalculated. Okay, that's nothing here.
It's just nothing new. Yeah.
But the first several months of his presidency were spent on a premises that there should be a ceasefire, and then all kind of agreements would have to be negotiated and agreed upon and so on. That never happened, and finally it was completely defeated in Alaska, where it was obvious that the Russians are insisting that it's all peace altogether in all directions, or there will be no peace. So from Alaska, it was in August. It's already 4 or 5 months after Alaska. What progress do you see is happening, and what if and when would happen so there will be a peace? Because in my opinion, there will be no peace whatsoever. It's all waste of time, it's destruction, and nothing. Russia hasn't yielded even 1 millimeter of their position. They're still on the same position when they were in January, in May, in August, in November, and in December. I really don't understand what all these meetings today, tomorrow, with Ukrainians, with Russians, and so on. How do you see it?
Well, the Trump administration has, up to this point, been essentially arguing for peace in a vacuum. They're doing it in a vacuum. They are doing it without regard to the political objectives of the other side. Apparently, the belief is that you can somehow separate economic considerations from political considerations, and you can't. And the point is, you can't do that. The Russians have proven that you cannot do that. The Russians do not believe in compromise in the sense that we understand compromise, because they translate their word for compromise as mutual surrender. Surrender is distasteful to the Russians. The Russians are arguing in the currency of power, and the Americans are arguing the currency of economic benefit. They're speaking 2 different languages. Neither side understands the other. The Trump administration apparently does not understand why the Russians would be unwilling to make an economic deal. Everyone should be willing to make a profitable economic deal in principle. And the Russians, they said, you don't understand. We are not interested in money. We are interested in Ukraine. Ukraine belongs to us. Ukraine should not exist. And therefore, we are going to take all of Ukraine unless you go ahead and give it to us, or give us what we consider acceptable peace agreements, which means the surrender of territory. And in effect, they're arguing for a reward for their having launched the war. So here you have 2 nations speaking incompatible languages. It's not. They may have translators translate for English to Russian, but they are speaking incompatible strategic languages, economic versus political. So, in that sense, Sasha, there is no attaining peace in the sense of everybody agrees to kiss and make up and go home. No, you in this case, given the Russians' behavior and both in their terror attacks against the Ukrainian population, as well as their continued seemingly suicidal meat attacks with an inferior logistics system and bad tactics, expending manpower, the only way to achieve a successful outcome from the standpoint of Ukraine and Europe is you have to just beat the living daylights out of the Russians so badly that they are utterly incapable of continuing a meaningful offensive. And so what that means is that this $90 billion deal, which guarantees Ukraine's ability to continue its war for at least the next year or two, and possibly gaining access to all those frozen Russian assets, hundreds of billions of dollars worth, which could also be freed up and used to benefit Ukraine and help reconstruct it once the war is made to stop. In the interim, it all comes back to what I discussed before, the decisive counteroffensive. The Russians are reaching, in terms of what Clausewitz said when he talked about the culminating point. Eventually, the attacker reaches a point where he can no longer sustain the offensive. And that is the opportunity that the defender can use to launch a counteroffensive and start it back in the other direction.
Logical.
Very logical. Go ahead.
There was one moment in peace negotiations, sometimes in November, when Trump made announcement that he has a plan and to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, and he almost made up his mind to do it. Do you remember Russians' reaction? My God, they started to send their people, the delegation, to Florida, to Washington, to elsewhere, because for them that was the most scariest moment that Ukraine would get Tomahawks, and not 2 or 3, but say...
Hey, Sasha, guess what? They may yet get Tomahawks. Remember? If you don't like something that President Trump does, wait 10 minutes. Because the man has shown he is very much capable of changing his mind. Yes. He is not totally inflexible. He is not wedded to one course of action, regardless of what happens around him. He does observe, he does absorb, he does tweak things, he tries something different. So in this case, because he has such an economically dominated mindset, it is a gradual learning process that says, oh, okay, that didn't work. And well, I guess I'm going to, for example, with Iran refusing to pursue a nuclear capability, he learns, he says, okay, looks like I'm going to have to use those bunker busters. And he went ahead and did it. And it worked, at least for now. For now it has worked. And he's doing the same thing with Venezuela. He says, okay, they aren't stopping their shipping of illegal drugs into the United States. Looks like I'm going to have to use military power and force the issue and restate in our national security strategy that we are serious about defending the Western Hemisphere. Again, that's a learning process. It's different from what he was expressing before, but now he's doing it. So he is showing the capacity for change, which is at least promising. So that's not a cause. It's not a cause for despair. It is cause for exercising patience. I predict that President Trump will shift farther in the direction of firm military action once he sees that offering economic benefits to Russia is of absolutely no use, at least not with the current political leadership. It may well take Putin's death to finally propel Russia to a state of thought where, okay, our great leader has died. We no longer have a great leader advocating restoration of the Russian Empire. We better cut our losses and see if we can at least stop China from taking us over. So, that may well be their major strategic concern once this war is actually brought to a close by one means or another.
Yeah, Jonathan, next couple of days there will be very interesting developments with the Ukrainian and then Russian delegations in Florida. I'm more or less can imagine what Ukrainian delegation is going to discuss with Trump. I'm absolutely not clear what Russian delegation is going to discuss because they're already for a year discussing on and over the same thing. So what's now?
I can tell you what I can imagine what the Ukrainians are going to be talking about with President Trump behind the scenes. Says, Mr. President, we'd like some tomahawks for Christmas. Lots of tomahawks.
So then when Russian delegations will meet Trump, he will say, well, sorry, guys, I already directed the tomahawks to Ukraine. Any news from you?
Have a Merry Christmas.
Christmas to you and your families and Mr. Putin.
Yeah, and don't forget to duck.
That's right. Jonathan, thank you so much for today's program. And we have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Tuesday, same place.
Well,
same
excellent.
time.
I'm looking forward to seeing the news, the latest news from our man in Kiev.
Yes.
I think that he may well have an early Christmas present for us too. So
yeah.
You know.
Yes. Anxiously waiting for Tuesday. Thank you very much, and glory to Ukraine and United
God bless America, and God bless Canada too. Let's throw in Canada while we're at it. God is generous.
Our professor on there as well. Thank you so much, Jonathan. We'll see you next week on Tuesday. Bye-bye, everybody.